So out of necessity, we're going to try something a little bit different. I have my presentation here, and we are going to talk about standard 8.4, which is actually episode 4, which is discussing conservatives and liberals. But we need to go all the way back to the Lyndon Johnson administration and kind of rehash some of the stuff we've already talked about to understand the conservative backlash, and then to the liberal 1960s. And then we're going to see how that conservative backlash led to the liberal Carter administration, which then leads to another conservative backlash with the Reagan administration. Let's proceed. We've already talked about the civil rights and how Kennedy's memory was used to push civil rights, and we know a little bit about the Civil Rights Act. This was in Standard 8.1 and 8.2. Basically, the Civil Rights Act is banning racial discrimination in public areas, gives the federal government power to end segregation in schools, outlaws other racial and gender discrimination and hiring practices. I'm bringing this up again because what we're going to see is that modern politics, the stuff that's happening today, can be traced all the way back to the Johnson administration. It can be traced actually back to the New Deal when Franklin Roosevelt was trying to increase the size of the federal government, created what today we'd call the welfare state with things like Social Security and Social Security and all those other government spending programs. We can see the Civil Rights era. Again, the federal government trying to provide protections for certain groups. And then the Great Society, which is this anti-poverty program, was seen as federal government trying to get into people's lives. Conservatives tend to want a smaller government that doesn't regulate their actions. Liberals tend to support government actions that assist in things like the New Deal, welfare spending, the civil right promotion of civil rights, and so forth. So, in order to understand the conservative backlash, we have to understand what's happening. So, throughout this presentation, we're going to be looking at these backlashes. Now, the first thing is to understand what Lyndon Johnson is going to call the Great Society. Again, we've talked about this. This is often called the War on Poverty, officially called the Great Society. He's calling for economic and welfare measures. Basically, he's going to do things that are going to help promote things like healthcare for the elderly, called Medicare. Trying to look at what causes poverty. So education for young children so that they can enter school at the same rate as their white peers, or their non-poverty peers, because white people do benefit from these programs as well. It talks about immigration reform and voting rights, and these are big government actions, and conservatives don't support that. Remember, we talked just a moment ago about conservatives want a smaller government. Conservatives also say that this is wasted money. Maybe, but we do see that the poverty rate declines from the 1960s before these programs, and then 1964, Johnson's in office, the poverty rate does go down, right? And then in 1980, when these programs end, the poverty rate goes up a little bit, but overall the number of people living in poverty goes up in the 1980s. We'll talk about why that is in a second. We've also mentioned Lyndon Johnson and civil rights in 8.1 and 8.2, and again passes the Civil Rights Act, but there's still issues with voting rights. So this leads to things like the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer is interesting. Black and white and some Jewish population and others go down into the South during the Freedom Summer to push for voting rights. 3 of these young adults are actually captured by the KKK. They're killed execution style. At least in the movie Mississippi Burning, I believe. But there's still issues with this. We know this, right? In Mississippi, there's a law that actually required the names of potential black voters to be published in local newspapers for 2 weeks. Why? So that they could be threatened and intimidated. So voting rights are still an issue. This is what led to the Selma marches, right? There's a wonderful book series. Part of our individual missions is to look at the book series called March. So if you'd like to do that, that's really interesting. The Selma marches were a nonviolent protest. They were going to march from Selma to the capital of Alabama at Montgomery. They tried twice. The third time, the state troopers moved on them and attacked them, beating them mercilessly. The guy you see here in the top left is John Lewis. He nearly dies. There is a person, I wish I could remember his name, that does die during the Selma marches. And all of this shocks the nation into supporting the Voting Rights Act. They were actually trying to cross a bridge called the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Klan member. But the Voting Rights Act doesn't end discrimination overnight. Southerners did try to block the black vote. When the Voting Rights Act goes through, then all of a sudden, for a little while, politicians tried to court the black vote. They tried to get African Americans to vote for them, which is going to end with Nixon's Southern strategy in the 1970s. It's at this point we see a transition from these nonviolent moderate leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., we saw this in Standard 8.1, to those more militant efforts of people like Stokely Carmichael, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. And this militant effort makes what we're going to see is they call themselves the silent majority. Conservatives, right? Social conservatives, they see social upheaval. And this is going to lead to a backlash when people think that people like Malcolm X are simply trying to cause problems. And people like Stokely Carmichael, again, they see him as trying to cause problems with his doctrine of black power. The Black Panthers literally take militarism literally. These social conservatives tend to be white, tend to be fundamentalist, see this as society falling apart. And they want to go back to a simpler time where all these social problems didn't exist. And essentially what they want is to kind of backpedal on the civil rights movement. When you throw in things like the race riots, this is in Detroit, the one you see here, and in places like Los Angeles, it's actually Watts outside of Los Angeles, the conservatives, which had sort of been tentatively with the civil rights movement, it's a religious movement, social conservatives turn away from the civil rights movement because they see it as promoting social upheaval and violence and such. Now, by 1968, some conservatives believed that the civil rights movement also was helping African Americans at the expense of the white population, not realizing that many of the white population benefited as well, especially those in poverty. But this becomes sort of a conservative idea that ties into the smaller government argument. They want smaller federal power, right? They don't want the federal government to be able to force civil rights. And they want more power to the states, which wouldn't enforce these civil rights movements. And we know that because of things like the Jim Crow laws. This also ties into the Great Society, right? That anti-poverty program, which was based on welfare spending. Again, welfare doesn't mean direct spending. It could be things like Medicare, Medicaid. It could be direct payments, but it's also food stamps and such. Conservatives tend to believe that these government programs make people dependent on the government, and I guess the word would be lazy, so they're not going to go out and look for their own job. And conservatives tend to believe that people should have personal responsibility, go get a job, go support your own family, and don't rely on the government. Liberals tend to believe that these are short-term prospects, or that people need these sort of social safety net programs so that they can take other risks and so forth. Liberals also argue that the federal government can overcome the local prejudices like what we saw in the Jim Crow laws. They have the ability and the power to do so and are necessary. We also see that Johnson is very unpopular by the end of his term in 1968. He decides not to run for re-election in 1968 because of the Vietnam War. There was actually riots outside of the 1968 Democratic National Convention because of the various stances on Vietnam. With all of the social upheaval, the Detroit race riots, the fear that there was going to be sort of this African American uprising with people like the Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael. Because Vietnam was so unpopular and because the Democrats didn't have sort of a unified campaign, this guy here, Richard Nixon, ran for office in 1968 and won on what's called a law and order ticket. Essentially, let's get into it in a second. In the 1960s, there was a cultural upheaval with the baby boomers. A lot of the people born in the 60s and 70s, born in the 50s and 60s are now teenagers or young adults. They see the United States as having some problems. They're upset with the racism, the sexism, what they saw as imperialism in places like Vietnam. They see American culture as oppressive and consumeristic. And this leads to the church declining, right? We see in the 1960s there's a decline in church attendance. We can see that there's also a more educated secular section growing in urban areas. There's going to be conflict here. And some of these baby boomers become members of the counterculture. Sometimes you'll call them hippies. Hippies is a very subsection of this subsection called the counterculture. This is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? And they're opposing what some people would call a traditional American view. Conservatives backlash against the counterculture, right? This leads to what's called the silent majority, seeing all liberals as falling into this, what they saw as un-American lifestyle. And if that's how liberals are going to act, they shouldn't be able to participate in the government. They're not taking away their rights, but the silent majority is going to go out and vote, and they're going to try to push for legislation that prevents some of these actions. There's a fear that these countercultural values, and then this is also the time of the sexual revolution, where there's birth control and women's rights are being promoted. There is a fear that this is going to lead to broken families, increased drug use, a decline in what they see as family values. There's some slight ironies here that we're not going to talk about. And then all this idealism of make love, not war, and peaceful protest eventually changes, just like the civil rights movement went from sort of peaceful, nonviolent protest. The civil rights protest and the anti-Vietnam protests do end up becoming a bit more violent, with more riots and protesting happening there. And this leads us into the Nixon years. Now, the Nixon years are going to be seen as a conservative backlash, right? We had already talked about how the Johnson years were promoting all of these liberal, bigger government prospects. And then because Johnson becomes unpopular by the end of his term over Vietnam, a lot of his domestic programs are kind of swept up in there as well. Let's pause for a second, and then we'll talk about Nixon.